So welcome everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of the TAP Network Conversations series. This is a webinar series, a web series that we, as the TAP Network, have been hosting over the previous months, and really looking to highlight and showcase the work of TAP's really diverse membership. We're really happy to have our colleagues from the International Legal Foundation with us. We have Jennifer Smith, who is the director of International Legal Foundation. And we have Mohammad Waqar, who is the country director in Afghanistan. There's a lot of great work that ILF does at the international and national level. So perhaps maybe I'll just throw it over to you, Jen, if you want to just give us a brief overview of the work that ILF does and how it fits in with SDG 16 in particular.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much, John. It's an honor to be here, to be a member of TAP and to be invited to talk about this work. The International Legal Foundation, we're celebrating later this year our 20-year anniversary. And in those 20 years, we've been at the forefront of the fight for equal access to justice for those who are arrested and accused of crimes around the world. In particular, we believe that it is a universal human right for everyone who is arrested or detained to have access to high quality legal representation. This is something that since the Sustainable Development Goals were being discussed, we really tried to bring to the forefront that in addition to under Sustainable Development Goal 16.3, advocating that countries need to make progress towards access to justice, we really need to help those countries define what access to justice means and how they can make progress in their particular countries. And critical to making progress is ensuring that every single person has access to legal representation, whether or not you can afford it, no matter who you are, no matter where you are in the world.
Great, thanks a lot, Jen. And ILF is active in many countries, has country level offices. And again, we're really glad to have the Afghanistan country director, Waqar. If you can give us a little bit of an introduction to the work that ILF is doing in Afghanistan, just a really brief overview of the things that you're doing. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about some of those things in detail, but just give us a little bit of a primer on your work in Afghanistan.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. ILF established in 2003 in Afghanistan and started with two female defense lawyers here. That was the time when we had a total 150 defense lawyers across the country for almost, we can say, 35 million nation. So those 150 defense lawyers were active in the country, but their role was not active as a defense lawyer. I mean that they were not participating in client interview or defense investigation or advocating for the client. In like even they do not go to the court. They just submit like a defense statement to the court. So later on, we started in order to improve the situation, in order to prevent like any abuses, any discriminations against the right that the accusing suspect has. Then we changed it a little bit and transform the situation into practicing or taking case by case in the court and defending the clients. We brought like some improvement into that. And according to the law, as the people do not have like proper access to their rights, that was the biggest challenge. So the situation got improved. So as of today, we have almost 3,000 active defense lawyers in the country. We are 800 out of them, they are women. And we trained almost 1/3 of the total of those 3,000 defense lawyers in the country through our legal clinic programs. We are providing like early access to counsel. Like the situation is completely different compared to today. So there are lots of achievements. People, especially women and girls, they have proper access to justice, and they are all over the country. They can access justice at any stage and at any time.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in, John, I mean, what Waqar and his extraordinary and brave team of advocates have done in the last 15 plus years in Afghanistan is extraordinary and really illustrates how important access to legal representation is and how it can transform the understanding of justice throughout the country. You know, 15 years ago, as Waqar said, there was no sense of justice, right, for ordinary folks. They weren't able to go in to defend themselves against the power at that time of the Taliban and now the state. You know, torture, abuse, people being held for months or years without trial was commonplace, and that has been completely transformed. You know, 15 years ago, there was no legal aid system at all in Afghanistan. And that was started, that process, by ILF and going in, hiring the first 2 legal aid lawyers in the country. One was a woman. You know, we really fought for gender justice early on, but really pushing forward this ideal. And they've now been in court every day, getting cases dismissed, getting people found not guilty, pushing back against all that power of the state, ensuring that there is justice in people's lives. And I think most interesting, there was a report a couple of years ago that people's perception of justice, right, has increased tremendously, that they know what it means to have access to legal representation and to be able to exercise their voice in the process.
You are doing in Afghanistan, I think, sounds really inspiring and something that we can all learn from your experience. So I want to unpack this a little bit further with you in particular, Waqar, about what were the most significant things for you that led to the progress that you had made. I mean, it's one thing to do the work that you're doing to train legal aid professionals to engage in the process, but it's another thing entirely to actually have an entry point and to have the opportunity to do that. So justice systems, for example, have to be have to enable that kind of engagement and the work that you are doing. So I'm curious about your work with the government in particular. So what were the types of things over the course of the work that you've done? What were the most significant things that either you've achieved or that the government has done to enable this progress to be made over the years? And maybe we'll start with that. Just kind of what helped, in your view, what helped enable some of these things, and what were the key things, the key moments for you?
Yeah, there are a couple of important things. For example, as I earlier mentioned, the defense lawyer or lawyering from inactive, it was transformed into an active and meaningful role. Before, they were not even able to go to the court. Now they are challenging the violation in the justice system or the illegal systematic violation that is happening in the justice and judicial system. We are challenging that. So it means there are a great progress in that time, in that aspect. In another aspect regarding the government, as you mentioned, so with the government, as the government is also believe that without the civil society engagement in partnership, it's difficult to provide meaningful and effective legal aid or access to justice or access to legal aid to the accusing suspects. So that's why they also included like civil society into their work. So the civil society together with the government, they work in order to fight for the people right and to protect their right, which is given by the law. So these two important aspects I just wanted to mention briefly, so Jennifer may add something.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, what did you have to do to actually get the government to prioritize, you know, engaging with civil society and to prioritize laws and policies that enabled not just access to justice, but again, a more robust engagement with not just legal aid professionals, but again, civil society as well. So what were the types of things that you had to do to get the government to prioritize this? Whether it's creating formal bodies or laws. Again, we're hoping that more examples like this can be made in other countries. So you can share, what you did or what you did to help the government prioritize these approaches. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, John, first, it's important that the civil society organization work in a field that should be important to the government, and it should be accountable for the government too. Like when the government believe what you are doing and how you support in order to achieve their mission and their responsibilities, so definitely they will trust on you and they will engage much more on that. The second thing, civil society organizations are more flexible compared to the government institutions because of the bureaucracy, because of the paperwork there. So the civil society organization can bring the international standards and best practices in implementing on their day-to-day works, which give like a positive energy to the government that they will also trust again like on that field. The third one, from the beginning, it was our mission, and it's still our mission to strengthen the public defender system in Afghanistan. When we strengthen the public defender system in Afghanistan, so definitely we should engage with the Ministry of Justice, who is currently responsible for the legal aid in the country. So we were engaged with them, and we try our best in order to provide like expert advices to them, in order to provide like training to them, and also work on the laws, which we were also responsible for that to implement in practice the law and see any gap, any difficulties on those, and bring it back to the legislative directorate of the MOJ, Ministry of Justice. And all those then become that the MOJ saw like great and important effective work from the civil society organization, and they become like engaged with us together in order to build their system too. So that's why we are currently engaged with the Ministry of Justice in advancing their system, improving and developing their systems.
Yeah. Yeah, and if I can just jump in, I really think, and Waqar's modest, so he's not kind of talking about, all the hard work that he and the team put into this, but I think that, it was that hard incremental work over 15 years. I mean, of really being in the courts every day, pushing our way into the detention facilities, pushing our way into the prosecutor's office, and gaining respect of those frontline judges, prosecutors, police officials, who really saw, these lawyers are fighting for these citizens, our fellow community members. And we do believe at the ILF that, governments do want to see justice. I think often it's an issue at the highest levels of political will, lack of resources, lack of knowledge about what to do. So really convincing them that this way of getting the lawyers in, of educating clients, it would really advance access to justice. And the Ministry of Justice over time has really gained tremendous respect for the work that Waqar and his team is doing, and invite them into these conversations. So when there was an SDG 16 roundtable created, Waqar was named one of the leaders of that to really help to bring in data, what's working, what do we need to do, how can we continue to advance progress? We know that you all are on the front lines, even in some of the most conflict affected provinces. What are you seeing? What do we need to do? And then I think the second important piece was that we welcomed that collaboration with government early on. We do recognize that it is actually the government's obligation to provide legal aid services to every person who's arrested or detained, which means they need to fund it. They need to ensure its effectiveness and its accessibility, which means that we needed to, as the Ministry of Justice was creating a new institution, and we obviously were providing services before they did, we needed to develop those relationships and work with them and show them that we wanted to collaborate with them to also build their effectiveness and their ability to sustain this effort over the long term.
Great, yeah, and one of the follow-up questions that I had, even for both of you, is, this is a really great example and a great case of where, like you've both said, you have showcased the added value of not just, the value of the government in being inclusive in their approaches to access to justice and legal aid, but the value of you as an organization that you can provide and the areas that you can collaborate on and building that trust. I think that's one of the key things when it comes to working with government, is that there has to be that trust between the government and civil society, that this is a mutually beneficial endeavor. I mean, that we are both working towards the same things, and that we can only strengthen the work that we do together. But my question for both of you is, again, trying to unpack what this means for colleagues in other countries who may want to replicate this, this case that from Afghanistan. In a lot of cases, again, this might be possible, where the government is more open and inclusive, and there is this general trust between the government and civil society. But I'm curious about your suggestions for colleagues that may not live in contexts or countries where the government is completely open and the doors are open, and that civic space is, free and blossoming. I'm curious, what suggestions might you have for colleagues who live in a country or a society where civic space is shrinking and there aren't these opportunities? I mean, you've already mentioned a couple of things already, but I'm curious about your thoughts, and maybe if you've experienced some of these challenges in Afghanistan, or Jen, any other countries that ILF operates in. Just any thoughts about how we can ensure inclusive access to justice in countries and societies where civic space is shrinking, and maybe some approaches that maybe you've taken in this regards. Any thoughts?
It's a great question, and we certainly work in many countries where civic space, that space is shrinking, and civil society organizations are under attack. And I think what's extraordinary about the government of Afghanistan, and why we're really, happy that you're elevating this conversation, is they really understand that these are some of they're facing tremendous crises. And the only way to address those is through collaborating with those civil society organizations that have been on the ground for 15 years, those community advocates, really bringing everyone together to address these issues. But of course, I think there have been challenges along the way, right? It's really taken us 10 years, right, Waqar, to get where we are today, with getting the government to reform their approach to legal aid, to welcome in civil society in a really comprehensive way, and to agree over the long term to fund civil society to do this work. And I think that from your approach, I want to talk about an international piece that's really helped us to put pressure on governments. But maybe, Waqar, you can first talk about that kind of on the ground example. And one thing that always strikes me and that I remember early on was your efforts to get the police in Kandahar and Helmand to agree to let lawyers into police stations, to agree to let our lawyers into police stations, and how a lot of people just assume, don't even try, it's going to be too hard, even the central government, right? But that power of starting a conversation and getting people on the same page about what they wanted to see in their community. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, because I think that on the ground work is really important to achieving results.
Yeah, John, justice is something where, like, your opposition or your client should trust on that. And if it, for example, deliver from a single source or from a sole source, so definitely they may have objection, or they may not happy. They may want to switch, for example, the person. So if there is only like the government work or only like specific organizations, so definitely they have less chances for that. If we have, for example, the civil society work together with the government, so there is opportunity for building the trust of the people on the justice system that currently we built over the past 15 years in Afghanistan, that the nation now trust on the formal justice system in Afghanistan. And they would like to bring their cases to the formal justice system. So this is one aspect. In another aspect, as Jennifer mentioned, when we started early access to counsel, that was the time when, according to the law, upon arrest or at the time of arrest, the attorney should be there and he or she can provide defense for the client. But when it comes to the practice in Afghanistan, it was a bit difficult because no civil organization was tried that, no, the government was tried that. It was just on the law, on the paper. And we started from two provinces in 2013. It was very difficult time for us because when the police officers never experienced that a defense attorney come into their station and sign a contract with a suspect and would like to represent that from the custody. So it was not like experience for them, and they were completely against that. And it was very difficult time. Then we started discussing this with the Ministry of Interior, and we had like a series of trainings for the police officers. When we train them, then we advocate them, then together with them, we go to the police commander and discuss with the police commander, and the police commander then accepted that because he understand the rule of the important rule of the legal aid provider in providing like the right to the suspect from the early stage. And from that time, then we established duty liar desk within the police station, and then we expanded across the country. Now, over 60% of the cases that we take, they are in early stages. It means from police and prosecution stages. So it's a great progress, but it took almost 15 years.
Yeah, and I think that what that example illustrates is like, number one, that you brought everyone together, Waqar, at this table, and you really could get consensus, right? It was that, don't just assume the police are going to say no, don't just assume this, let's go in, let's start talking. You know, we're all Afghan citizens, let's talk together about how we can, you know, achieve real meaningful access to justice. And I think on the government side, then they also developed even more an appreciation for this civil society organization that was really working to help them to better advance the rule of law. And the last piece that I just want to say, I mentioned on the international piece, I think the ILF founded in 2014 what is now a biannual international conference that brings the world together to discuss common challenges and obstacles and best practices and innovations around access to legal aid. And we purposefully from the beginning made it a really inclusive event. So it's government, civil society, academics, international, local organizations, because we want everyone to understand they need to work together. And we also invited high-level officials, and we did for many years, right, Waqar, from the Minister of Justice, the Chief Justice from Afghanistan, so they could hear, right, why this was important, and also elevated them to speak about this collaboration, right? And I think that governments pushing each other and putting that pressure on each other and being proud and really providing an opportunity for them to lift up these examples and that's why the SDGs is so critical as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. I just wanted to add on that, John. Sorry for that. Just one addition. As Jennifer mentioned, we have like a series of roundtable discussions in Afghanistan each year in each province. And we bring together all the justice and judicial stakeholders together, from the police officer, from the prison authority, from the judicial authority, from the prosecution authority, Ministry of Justice, from human rights, from several organizations. They come together and then we discuss those common challenges that exist there. And through that, then we advocate for that. And finally, like where the challenge mostly exists, we try to address that part. And then we collectively like raise our voice and try to address the issue. So which is really important. The roundtable discussion was that, yeah.
I think really thorough example of how even colleagues that work at the local level can actually then turn the work that they do into eventually working with regional or provinces, and then bring it to ministries at the national level. And then Jen, you also just mentioned how we elevate this to the global level to put pressure on other governments to say, this is why this should be a priority. This is why it's in your best interest to be inclusive, and then share those experiences and share those positive examples of where, again, where governments have come together with civil society, improved their justice systems, and then showcase the added value for why that's a big deal, why it should be important to all governments. I think from the local to the international level, we've just kind of explored at least one strand of how colleagues that work at the local and grassroots level can elevate their experiences and connect it to the national level and then to the international level and the SDGs. So I think this is a really great case of how, colleagues, even if you think that, your impact is limited to the local level, it can eventually have an effect at much greater levels. So that was actually going to be one of my next questions, but I think we've fully explored that full strand there. I think one thing, I think this, again, a great example of the many years of work that ILF has in Afghanistan. But I think one thing that we've seen over the past year or so is obviously the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impacts on access to justice and justice systems. It has created huge challenges for governments and civil society, across the spectrum and across many issues within SDG 16. But I think on the issue of access to justice in particular, I think we've seen this play out in very real terms on many, again, related to many things, not just access to legal aid, but in regards to civic space, et cetera. So I'm curious about, from both of your experiences, from the Afghanistan experience and the international experience of ILF, I'm curious about, how COVID-19 has impacted the situation that you work in, and in particular, how it relates to the pretrial detention that you mentioned and access to legal aid. So if you can just give us a little bit of an overview of how you've been affected by COVID-19 and how maybe you've worked to overcome some of those challenges that the pandemic has brought.
Waqar, why don't you start in Afghanistan?
Okay, yeah. John, COVID was impacted not only Afghanistan, but the whole world. And it was definitely impact Afghanistan a bit, I can say more because of the poverty, because of the security, because of the several challenges and conflicts that's ongoing in the country. During the COVID-19 last year, it was started from the March when we had like a lockdown here in Afghanistan. During the lockdown, the only office which was remained open was the ILF Afghanistan, and we provided our services. Because we believe that justice shouldn't be like shut down at any time. All the time, justice should be there. And we started with the government. We filed a huge number of requests to the prosecution office for pre-trial releases and also to the court. Then we had an urgent call for action to the president of Afghanistan and to the Supreme Court, Attorney General Office, Ministry of Interior, and several other related organizations in Afghanistan. Because of the overcrowded population or in detention centers, in prisons, and they become like affected of the COVID. And upon that, the president of Afghanistan took an action and released an amnesty decree where 10,000 detainees and prisoners were released on the first one. And following to that, we had another amnesty decree where 12,000 more was released. It means in total 22,000 were released. There were like a lot of important aspects for that. For example, before the COVID-19, some of the law articles we saw, which was not like greatly practiced, or somehow they were ignored like prior to that. During the COVID-19, we worked for that, and finally, especially through our legal team, we address those issues and we practice that. Even according to that, then the Attorney General Office also released a procedure, and then the Supreme Court released a circular letter and advised all to the judicial organs in the Attorney General Office, advised to the prosecution office across the country in all of the provinces to help in this tough and complex situation. And they should try to be according to the law, all their decision. So that was I left Afghanistan, had a great achievement toward that. We started the re-entry program in Afghanistan because during the COVID-19, almost 800 women were released from the detention in prisons. And some of them, they had problem with rejoining or reintegrating with the society and with their families. And then we provided services for them. The services include some reentry kits, like sanitizer, mask, guide for the COVID-19, in a cell phone to be in contact with the lawyer if they have trouble or any difficulties throughout the time. And then following that, we also refer them to the mental health or medication and those several other type of services. So yeah, during that time, we helped with almost 180 plus female clients who were released from the detention in prisons. So Jennifer, you may add something.
Yeah, no, I think that Waqar really well explained that COVID has both been devastating for the communities that we represent, right? Because our clients had no way to protect themselves in the detention facilities that they were detained in, and criminal justice systems in many places came to a halt. Afghanistan was relatively fortunate that I think that the lawyers were allowed to continue to represent, frankly, at great kind of threat to their own health and safety, because there were not a lot of precautions in place initially, but our team felt strongly that they needed to go and try to get people out of detention. But in many places, still today, the courts are closed, right? And you have people that are just stuck indefinitely in detention, people who never should have been there, young children. And so what it's really caused us to do as an organization is to reflect and think about how we can pressure governments to innovate, how we need to innovate to better ensure access to justice. One of the problems, which I know we're all well aware of, is mass incarceration. The fact that if someone's arrested, just throw them in jail, and there is no opportunity for them to really get out, either pre-trial, post-trial, really little reflection on alternatives to incarceration and other types of more progressive dispositions that the government should be considering. And so for us as an organization, we've really taken a step back and said, let's look at the data, let's look at what has been happening with our clients. For example, in Afghanistan, where we see that women are being more harshly treated during COVID, women in detention, because they don't have funds available to them to be released. They don't have access to the family's resources, but also they have no safe place to go afterwards. So really leaning into that client-centered, people-centered approach and thinking about what's actually going to help our clients in their lives, not just in the case. But I think also leaning in on some big reforms that need to happen. And children in conflict with the law is a big space where we're really pressuring governments to lean more into diversion, to look at ways in which children should never have been brought into the justice system in the first place. And just a couple of quick examples in Tunisia, where mediation exists, really elevating the use of mediation as a way for the alleged offender, the alleged victim, but also the entire community to come together and say, here's what we want to see in this case. Here's what would make us feel better, which is much better than going to a court. Having someone locked up really doesn't benefit any particular party in the case. And the second example is in Nepal, where children, again, routinely locked up for minor offenses. We just found a child the other day in detention who had been there for 3 years. He was sentenced to 15 days in prison, but given a fine that he could never have paid, and he was kept in to kind of work off that fine. There's a daily amount that that you work off each day, and so we're seeing that there are these children who are locked in the system and have gotten permission from the detention facility facilities to go in and essentially interview every single child and look for the most progressive options to get these children released, and maybe have a different way of looking at what access to justice should mean for the government and for these communities.
Great, yeah, and I think this is, from just speaking from the global perspective, I mean, one of the big challenges that we've seen from the COVID-19 pandemic and in relation to, justice systems and access to justice, I think you mentioned the pretrial detention issue, and the issue where, the great case in Afghanistan where there's been this effort to prevent the overcrowding in prisons and then supporting reentry of people into society. I think that's really great and inspiring work. But I'm curious, I mean, from your perspective, I mean, again, from the global level, we've seen a lot of resources and efforts diverted from governments from issues around SDG 16 plus, like access to justice, diverted from these issues and dedicated to public health response, which is completely understandable. I think there's no doubt that we were facing a global crisis. But I'm curious about what your thoughts are on how we get governments to still prioritize SDG 16 plus, given the challenges, not just at the global level, but in country. How do we ensure that governments still prioritize SDG 16 plus and use some of these things as, use some of these issues like access to justice to merely just think about how their public health response affects access to justice and vice versa. And again, how we can ensure that there's a priority still. SDG 16 is still high on the agenda in many for many governments. But again, how do we make sure that the response to the pandemic is also seen through an SDG 16 lens? So how do we get them to say we need effective and strong institutions and investment in institutions in order to have an adequate response to crises like pandemics? So from each of your perspectives, just some quick thoughts on what you've done to maybe ensure that governments are still prioritizing your issues and SDG 16 in general. And what are some of your suggestions for other organizations or for the global community on how we can ensure that SDG 16 isn't left behind, that it's still clearly in the focus of the international community and for government? So any thoughts on global and then the approach in Afghanistan?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's really critical, two things. One is to show that, you have to think of these issues together, right? The right to health, the right to justice, and that the people who are caught up in the criminal justice system, certainly our clients, are often from the most marginalized communities, those most left behind, those most likely to have health consequences if they get COVID-19, those least able to access health services. And so it's really about, advancing the health and the peace and the stability of the entire country when you focus on those most marginalized communities. Certainly in the United States with the Black Lives Matter movement over the last year, we've really seen, right, what happens when, we understand that entire groups of people have essentially been left out of the conversation and are not supported by their governments. And that's the case not just in the United States, but everywhere in the world, that racial injustice, ethnic injustice, religious injustice, gender injustice exists, and that people don't feel a part of their government. They don't trust their government. They don't have this perception of justice, and that does great damage. And I think Waqar could talk about this more in the Afghan context, certainly with the instability. But I think the second piece is really making really clear that SDG 16 is not a choice. It's not discretionary, right? But the governments have the obligation to protect the fundamental human rights of their citizens, and they have to invest in it. And one of the challenges we've had is really in elevating this conversation, not just in the countries in which we work, but at the international level, right? Because there's billions of dollars going into security systems, court systems, prosecution systems. But when we were founded, really no money going into defense, and really no understanding that none of these people being arrested, brought before the courts, had any representation. And you're feeding into greater human rights abuses in that way if you're funneling all the money towards one side and there is no balance and no one standing between that person and all the power of the state. So I think that piece of really making clear that this is fundamental, that we need to address the right to health, we need to address COVID, but that we also need to fund this work is really important.
Yeah, John, it was a great question. In Afghanistan, we can say when we defend the right of our client, it definitely includes the health component as well, because we are afraid of the situation of the COVID on those who are crowded detention centers in prisons. When, for example, the COVID affect the people who there is no social distancing, there is no like proper facilities in place. Like here in Afghanistan, there is no proper mask wearing, there is no proper social distancing in the crowded detention in prisons. So definitely they are also become effect of the COVID in the Ministry of Health as they like take care of everyone's in the country. So definitely they have obligation and they have responsibility to take care of those prisoners as well. So that was one component where the Ministry of Public Health tried their best in Afghanistan, but still because of the low awareness, or we can say minimum awareness in Afghanistan of those type of disease, the literacy is very low here in Afghanistan. People don't have enough information regarding those type of like very serious disease. So all these problems then become like affecting the prisoners or the clients that we are defending for their rights. So that was like one part. In another part, when from my perspective, for example, may the COVID-19 may not kill someone, but you know, when like as an Afghanistan society or societies, that they are most vulnerable societies. So if their family member without reason, they are in prison for a long time, or for example, for a time even beyond the law, which says, so their family members definitely will affect, and they will face with difficulties. Even they cannot find their daily foods, so they will become like most vulnerable, and they will may they commit like any type of crimes. So that's why it's important in these type of societies that the government take like the right action in order to release those who are without any proper like documents, proper proofs. So they are in detention centers or in police custody or in prisons. So this is like really important. But in Afghanistan, when the president of Afghanistan took an action to release amnesty decrees and to release like a huge number of the prisoners, so all of those because of the COVID-19 is definitely impact like this type of society, like where the government do not have any support to the families or to the livelihood here in Afghanistan. They cannot give a penny to them. But from other side, they got COVID-19 and they affected with that. So that's like a bit difficult situation. So that's why like here we, the civil society organizations, we tried our best to convince the president of Afghanistan, the justice and judicial organs, in order to take the right decision, and they took. So the people were happy. Definitely, they access like justice on the right time. Before that, there was also access to justice they have, But during the COVID-19, there was like two difficult situations that they faced with. And at least they got out from the difficult situation. Then it's difficult for the government, for the Ministry of Public Health as well. They do not have enough facilities. They do not have enough beds. They do not have enough, for example, oxygen balloons in these type of facilities to provide like treatment for them. So that's why it was the right action in the right time in Afghanistan.
Challenges that COVID has had on justice systems and SDG 16. We could unpack this for hours and days, but I think these are some good examples. I'm sure colleagues have faced somewhat similar circumstances in many countries, but it's great to hear your experiences and your approaches in ensuring that people still had access to justice and legal aid, even despite the challenging circumstances. So just to kind of wrap things up, those of us that engage at the international level know that the high-level political forum on sustainable development, this is the forum that discusses the SDGs and the 2030 agenda overall through the UN. The HLPF this year will review SDG 16 for the second time. The last time SDG 16 was reviewed was in 2019, 2 years ago. And so this will be a big opportunity for us to come to the HLPF, take stock of where we are in regards to SDG 16, and then address what needs to happen. So what do we need to do, particularly given these challenging times? What do we need to do to ensure that SDG 16 plus is high on the agenda at the international level and for governments? So I'm curious if just in a really brief, like maybe like a tweet-sized statement from each of you, if you can give us what you think, what's your message that you want to bring to the HLPF this year? What needs to happen going forward for us to improve SDG 16 implementation? Maybe Jen, you can share some thoughts at the global and international level, and Waqar, you can share some thoughts with what governments might need to do to advance SDG 16 plus. So what's your message in a tweet? What's your message that you would bring to the HLPF in regards to prioritizing and implementing SDG 16 plus?
So I would say every government needs to commit to strengthening, to providing access to quality legal representation to every person arrested or detained. It is a fundamental human right. And unless we address this crisis, we will never address the underlying challenges of excessive pretrial detention, torture, wrongful conviction. And I just want to, I know this is longer than a tweet, but the Afghanistan, we hope that they will highlight at the high-level political forum. They submitted a acceleration action, right? And they specifically have committed to this, and we know that they're anxious to really showcase some of the progress they've made and to encourage other governments to do the same.
I can say if the government wants their nation to trust on their justice system, so they need to prioritize the SDG 16 plus, and they need to give it like a good time, and they need to bring like development into that, and they will provide like quality access to the basic rights, and especially access to justice, access to legal aid to their nations. So
great. And I think you both did fairly well there with keeping it short and succinct, like a tweet. But I mean, just in summary, I mean, we've talked a lot in the limited time that we've had today, just about obviously the impact of what improving legal aid and access to legal aid can have on justice systems. I mean, I think again the work of ILF largely speaks for itself. So we're grateful to have your perspectives and sharing your experiences on that work. But then also, again, we've talked a bit about the impact that has on, particularly related to leaving no one behind. for example, government's commitments to ensuring that no one is left behind, and also on, again, strengthening trust between citizens and their governments, and why improving access to justice is a critical part of that trust building. So I'm looking forward, again, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. Really looking forward to working more closely with ILF, particularly in the lead up to the HLPF, but also beyond as well. Thanks once again to both of you for sharing your experiences. For those of us that are part of the TAP membership, this is an ongoing opportunity that we'll have over the months to come. We really, again, want to showcase great and inspiring examples like the work that ILF is doing in Afghanistan and at the global level. So for colleagues that are interested in being a part of this conversation series, please do get in touch. We'll be sharing much more information on this opportunity in the weeks and months to come. So again, Waqar and Jen, thanks again for all of the work that you do at all levels and for joining us for this conversation. And we'll surely be in touch and working together a lot more closely in the days to come.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, John.